Hello, everyone, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this first in a series of PublisHer interviews. And these will be a series of candid conversations with influential and inspiring book women from all over the world. As you may know, PublisHer is a worldwide community of female publishing leaders who are working to address the publishing industry's age-old gender imbalances, especially at the executive level where the disparities are the greatest. Now, in this series of interviews, we'll travel from region to region, and we're starting right here on the African continent, where I'll be conducting several interviews myself before handing over the reins to another interviewer somewhere else in the world. My name is Maimouna Jallow, and I'm the director of Positively African, and it's an organization that works in the literary and performance space. I'm a playwright, writer, theater director, and also a performer. And today I'll be speaking to Angela Wachuka. So Angela Wachuka is the co-founder of Book Bunk, and it's a firm driving the restoration and programming of some of Nairobi's most iconic public libraries. Before that, she was executive director at Kwani for many years. And during the time she was there, nearly 10 years, they published over 250 authors. And not only that, in 2019 and 2020, Wachuka was an African leader at the Obama Foundation. Welcome, Wachuka.
Thank you, Maimouna.
How are you doing?
I'm good, despite everything. I cannot complain. How are you?
I'm good. Wachuka, before I go into the questions about books and publishing, I have to ask, did you get to meet Obama himself or Michelle?
Not yet. We gathered in Johannesburg in South Africa. They were not there at the time, but hopefully some other time maybe they'll come to the library.
When you do, don't forget to call me over for that dinner party, yeah? Angela, you've had a really amazing trajectory. But before we go backwards, I want us to start where you are right now. You've got a new baby, Book Bunk. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, it's definitely my favorite thing. So Book Bunk was something that Wanjiru Koinange and I started in late 2017 was when we actually formalized. Wanjiru has been a friend for a long time. I met her through this world of books. When I was working at Kwani, she worked with us as festival producer because we used to put on this festival every 2 years called the Kwani Lit Fest, some of which you came to as well. So I worked with Wanjiru then, and I was always really amazed by her production skills and her ability to just piece so many beautiful things together. And one of the things I remember at the time that we were really keen on was using other spaces in Nairobi. We felt like we'd really kind of exhausted the sort of spaces that we were putting on events at associated with that festival. And we were really keen to put on some events in public spaces. So we started to look at all manner of public spaces across Nairobi. And that's how we came across the Macmillan Memorial Library, right in the heart of town. We were so excited at the possibility of doing something there, but looking at its condition, it just was not possible to plug all the things that we needed to host the amount of people that we wanted to. But the library stayed on our mind, and we felt really strongly about the condition that it was in, how it was being managed. It had very few resources. The books in it were super old. It felt like being in this place that was trapped in the past. And it just wouldn't leave our mind. So we kept going back. We became friends with the librarians. I was publishing at the time, of course. So then we would send book donations, but none of these things felt like they were enough. So when Jiro got commissioned by the Commonwealth Foundation to write a piece about living in Nairobi, and it could focus on any aspect of life that she wanted to. And that was what kind of gave us the real impetus to do the research about this library. So she spent quite a bit of time researching its history, and all the things that we were finding out were just so fascinating. And we knew that there was no way that we would not try to do something with that space formally. And so we did. We went to see the city. We kept knocking on that door. The process took us a couple of years, but we finally got our partnership going with them. And so that's what we're working on now.
Mhm. And I mean, for those who don't know the Macmillan Library, it's a beautiful building and right in the middle of town. So from the outside, it just looks like this great, elegant building. But as you say, on the inside, really you could see the effects of, I guess, decades and decades of neglect. One thing that I find very interesting about the space and about the work that you're doing is that historically the Macmillan Library was built for white people only. So now with this transformation, this regeneration of the space, I'm curious to know about what you're doing to make sure that it becomes a space that belongs to Nairobians again, that everybody feels that they can walk in and that they belong there.
That's a great question, Maimouna. It was one of the things that really bothered us from the get-go, because you see that kind of history really reflected even in the collection of books. You know, when you look on the shelves, you don't see Nairobians or Kenyans or Africans for that matter on the shelves. It really is an ode to a kind of colonial opulence, if you like. It's very grand in the way that it has been built, but also the material in it reflects, you know, that sort of trajectory. I don't think that the thinking at the time was that Africans would be able to use it at any point. It's a thing that kind of underpins how we have directed or chosen to work on the library. So the first thing that we did was a bunch of research, and it was down to the basics even of counting the amount of people who are coming in daily, asking them questions. Where are you coming in from? How long do you spend in this library? What do you do while you're in the library? And of course, then you also capture data. You see that some are women, some are men, some are young kids. And that really kind of gives you an idea of what the demographics using the library look like. Immediately, we also knew that we had to make it a very public process. So we went into these consultative series that we put on every quarter, where we literally ask everyone questions about what they would like to see happen. And the list that the public gave us then became the first thing that we started to do. You know, a lot of people were talking about Wi-Fi installation, the kind of material that's available, but also the diversity of what's available in terms of experience in those spaces. Last year, we hosted 23 public events, and 19 of these were actually put on by Nairobi residents. We did a public call out, and we asked people to apply for support so that they could host the kind of events that they want to put on at the library. So there's public participation on so many fronts, and because it's quite a complicated process, we have to keep this as a continuous thing. So we ask a lot of questions also when people come to these events, and that data kind of gives us the information that we need to then drive things like even the design.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And have you found in the time that you have been doing events, I know they were cut short because of the COVID restrictions, but have you seen a different kind of people coming into the library now?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. One of the events that really struck me last year was one where we were showing a film. We worked with the Museum of British Colonialism, which is run by Tayana Chow, who's a wonderful, wonderful woman doing a lot of work around memory and remembering the past and reconstructing things like Mau Mau camps. So she co-produced a documentary called Operation Legacy, which basically looked at, you know, there was this huge campaign by the British government to hide all these records of the things that they had done while they were in charge of countries here and elsewhere in the world. So a kind of like hiding of colonial history. So this documentary actually profiles Mau Mau veterans who took the British government to court and won the case because of all the kind of inhumane things that the British government had done to them. And so this, you know, this film was showing at the library, and we were really surprised also by the amount of senior citizens who came to the event. So we started to see also older people, not just young people coming in, but older people, and them telling us that they're really craving for kind of cultural events that connect them with younger people. So that's an event that really struck me because I started to also think about the amount of events I go to in Nairobi and how I hardly ever hear about events that are specific to our senior citizens.
Mm, mm. So that's great. I mean, you want it to be a space for young kids to be able to come and read and discover, but also for elderly citizens to come and perhaps for the first time, have their stories recognized and told and shared with the wider public. One of the things that I notice also a lot with your work is that in building these libraries, in these kinds of spaces, what you're doing is not just saying, okay, we'll publish more books. What you're doing is actually working to make sure that more people have access to these books. Because if not, the danger is that we publish more books, but it's still the same elite who have access to them. I know that through my performances, one of the things I do is adapt novels and short stories into shows, but it's precisely to diversify the kind of access to literature by presenting it in new and different ways. So it's really interesting, the kind of events that you guys are holding, and that it's not just a space for books to live in and people to come and read books, but where they can actually experience culture. Tell me, what do you have planned around events? What more can we expect to see at Book Bunk?
Oh my goodness. Obviously, we're having to rethink our approach as well when it comes to events, because the very basis of it, the idea that many people will congregate in a space, is probably a reality that we're not going to have available for a while, just seeing what's happening with this pandemic everywhere. Mm-hmm. But we're super excited to divert some of this to digital programming. So we'd like to still offer the full range of things that were being offered physically at the libraries, but as a digital experience. And one of the things that we've really had to think about also over the past 3 months is accelerating access to things like newspapers and things like that, all the archives, the collections that are held at the library that people want access to. We actually thought this would come a little further down the road, but I think also this COVID has forced everyone to kind of rethink how they're thinking about their work processes. So that's now come to the forefront of what we're working on at the moment. So we've got, partnerships that we're pursuing at the moment that would possibly make all these collections available to people soon, hopefully in the course of this year or early next year. We've got the building work going on as well. We've just completed Kaloleni. We hope to get started on Makadara in a few weeks.
So these are other libraries in Nairobi.
The other branches of the library. And then the mothership, it's a listed building. It takes quite a lot of planning ahead and whatnot. So that will take us a while. We don't foresee being able to work on that building physically until next year.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that it's, a public library, and this is a public-private partnership, the restoration of these spaces. And we all know that governments all over the world, particularly ours, can be very bureaucratic. What has that experience been like, from going into this just because, I want to see this space alive again, I love books, to suddenly having to deal with the politics and the bureaucracy around it? Do you have any stories about that?
Do we? It's been very interesting. It's been very interesting because one of the things that we found particularly jolting was the fact that this was the first of its kind sort of partnership with the government, and we're talking obviously regional government now. When we started this project, we just thought, we'll formalize it, that's it. Probably have to do a little bit of paperwork, but we've always kind of looked at it from the prism of culture, heritage, books, literature, right? But when you start to encounter the bureaucracy that you're talking about, it really does teach you a lot about, I think, how the sector needs to interact with government, and just kind of, we need to do a lot of learning about the governance of cities and countries, because if these buildings are supposed to be performing functions that we want to amplify, it's a sad reality that we just have to deal with the bureaucracy that's associated with it. So we found it odd that it was the first kind of time that there was a partnership of this kind. And because it was the first of its kind, there were very many things from that process to learn from. We had to learn a lot also just about how do you petition, things like national county, Nairobi County, for example, all the processes. Do you have to deal with all the people who are elected in as MCAs, like county assembly members? So it was quite a lot to learn and deal with. It took a long time, but in the end, we found that it's a learning process, I think, for both entities. They're learning as much as we're learning about these processes. So yeah, it's been interesting, to say the least.
And hopefully, you learn and then you teach somebody else, and next time it's not as difficult and these processes become maybe a bit more standardized, and, you can have more partnerships with government. Absolutely.
Yeah, and Maimouna, that's one of the things that we were really adamant about creating from the beginning. So, we're calling it a blueprint, but it's not really that. It's just like an archive of our process and of our experience. We would love for people to be able to go on our website, for example, and just access, do you want to get into a partnership with the county government? Click here, here's a form, here's a contact, this is a person that you can call. Here are the processes that you have to go through. So we really don't want people to have to learn this again. Yeah. It would be kind of pointless, to be honest. So we'd really, really want to share our experience, and we're going to be doing that on our website pretty soon. In the meantime, what we've done is document the process in terms of, we take loads of photographs. So we have a lot of imagery of just the transformation and the transitions. There's a documentary film as well being made by Circle and Square, who've been following us through the process. So even in that film, you can see the actual hurdles that we had to go through. You kind of follow us through City Hall as we go and negotiate certain clauses and whatnot. So we really want it to be an open process, so that people can see what is possible, but also that it isn't as hard for them if they want to follow the same channel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. And we do have to make sure that we learn from each other and share this knowledge. As you say, we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel every time we're doing, something like this. Angela, I want to take you a bit to your publishing life. And I know that there's Book Bunk, and then there's Bunk Book, which is the publishing arm of it. And that you've just released a new book, your first one, which is Wanjiru Koinange's The Havoc of Choice. Tell us a bit about the publishing arm and how it feels, to finally have the first book out.
Oh my goodness. To be honest, it's not a world that I thought that I would be returning to, or at least not anytime soon. But I suppose if you have the publishing bug, you just have it, right? It's a thing that kind of never leaves your system. So we started Bunk Books, I'd say, well, as an idea, we started talking about it a while ago, but we formalized it not too long ago. And our first title, The Havoc of Choice, is something quite exciting for us to put out. The reason why we wanted to have Bunk Books exist as an entity is because both of us, Wanjiru and I, and many others who've worked in the sector, at least in the past decade, saw what 100% reliance on donor funding has done to organizations. And it's a very, very sad thing to watch. I think it's a real thing that we do have to think about other earned income sources. We have to think about revenue streams that are not always grants. But what we know how to do is to work in this sector. So we wanted to start something that is commercial in nature, that can help support some of the expenses that the trust has in refurbishing libraries. So we've got two publications. Our first one is The Havoc of Choice by Wanjiru Koinange, and then we have a children's book, Sulwe by Lupita Nyong'o, which we're very happy to be publishing also in various languages, African languages. That's something that's very important to us. And so, only two titles in, very new, very fresh, lots to learn. We're only in stores from this month, actually.
Mm-hmm. And what's the process you go through to choose what books to publish? Because there's been a lot of criticism, right? Particularly now, with Black Lives Matters movement getting more traction globally and many different sectors being told to look inward and question, their own inclusion, diversity, etc. And the publishing industry definitely is one of them. It's been accused of being very white, very middle class, very male. I believe it still is, although you have more and more young independent publishers coming out. But how do you choose which book to go with to make sure that you can actually make a return on that investment?
That's a really good question. And I'd like to take you back a little bit to illustrate exactly what you're saying. Several years ago, when I was at Kwani, one of the biggest projects that we work on was the Kwani Manuscript Prize. And what that involved was, I believe it was our first major call out for novel length work. And I may be wrong, I may have to look up the numbers again, but it may have been something like 189 submissions that we got. And out of that were people that we ended up publishing for the first time. Jennifer Makumbi from Uganda, Sami Limono from Liberia. Who else ended up in that series? I believe we also, I'm completely blanking, I'm sorry. We had Ayobami Adebayo from Nigeria. And it's just to say that that process of opening up, I think, you will be, it makes absolute sense to do things that way. And so I think that's the model we would like to follow. We want to be wide and not narrow. So think public call out as opposed to commissioning. But of course, there are also times when we think that a thematic kind of focus is important. We loved what Lupita Nyong'o's book is doing for children in terms of addressing identity and colorism. And we thought that was an important discussion to have. So we optioned that book. I thought that what Wanjiru was writing about connected to the memories of the post-election violence in Kenya in 2007 was a very important conversation to have. So we optioned that book. So I think it will be a mix between optioning along the lines of themes that we care about as an entity, but also democratizing the space in terms of the number of voices that are available to talk about any particular topic. And also opening up opportunities, because I do hear you when you say that the publishing industry, even here, has been quite insular. There have been long-standing conversations about the existence of cliques, and questions of access, like people just not being able to have access to particular entities and to particular publishers and people, and this idea that you've got to know people, for your work to be read. So we'd like to treat that process with dignity. I've seen both sides of that and how that works. And it doesn't make sense at any level to keep being narrow. It makes more sense to be wider. The multiplicity of voices is good for everyone, the publishers included. And it makes commercial sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting you say that, because I know that within the writing circles, one of the things that we complain about as writers is also this notion that a publisher will only be interested in your work if they can get it into the school curriculum, because then they're guaranteed massive sales. And then, how much do you have to censor yourself to be able to make it in that list? And who do you have to know? And that it really is a clique that is hard to penetrate still for many of us. Tell me, Angela, you studied law and anthropology. I was reading up a bit about you. How did you even end up in publishing?
By mistake. It was an absolute mistake. So after studying anthropology and law, I literally sent an email to an editor of BBC Focus on Africa magazine every single week. Alison Kingsley Hall, you worked there at the time, you were on the radio side of things. So I made my way into BBC Africa on the publishing end of things, and I worked there while I was a student. And that's when the publishing bug hit me, because then I really understood numbers as well, distribution, circulation. I had to talk to a lot of distributors across Africa about where the magazine was going. I had to get a lot of data back about circulation, about readership, create profiles of readers and that kind of thing. And it was very fascinating to me. Moved over to radio after that on the production side of things, stayed for some time. And while I was doing that, there was an interview booking with someone from Kenya who I found very fascinating. So I made sure that I was on that job. And so we went to interview this person who had started a literary network in Kenya, was publishing stories. It was all the buzz at the time. And it happened to be the Kwani Journal, and this was Binyavanga Wainaina. And that's how I met Binya in London, I believe in 2006 or 2007. And I was just so taken away. You knew Binyavanga. A lot of people who met him would be blown away. He was literally such a large personality and had so much to say about everything. So I was pretty blown away by what they had put together back in Nairobi and the things that he was talking about doing and all the possibilities that he was saying he wanted to experiment with. And then he started to make this suggestion that maybe I should think about helping out with the structure of it. And I thought, never, could never. But then I ended up doing it. I moved back to Nairobi and I joined him at Kwani initially as managing editor. And I do have to say the first 3 years were just kind of really hard graft because it was a typical sort of, I was coming from a very kind of heavy operations side. And Kwani at the time was very, very gifted on the sort of content creation side, but not so much with the structures. So I spent the first few years just kind of putting those in place. And that gave me a really kind of good idea of the sort of structures that we need to thrive. And I'm also the kind of person that enjoys building those structures. I'm not myself a creative person, but I do enjoy building structures to make work that creatives produce possible to disseminate, to distribute, and all of it. So that's kind of how I ended up there. I went via the BBC, and then I met Binyavanga, and then I ended up at Kwani, and then I got stuck in it.
I mean, I'm interested what you're talking about, what you're saying about structures, because, I come more from the creative side now, trying to build a structure around the creativity, and it's incredibly difficult. And I'm, struck also by what you said earlier, that so many organizations are so donor dependent or 100% donor dependent, which means that when the funding dries up, there's no way for them to continue. Just to wrap us up, because you've been in this industry for a long time, for people who are interested in publishing, of getting into publishing, what are some of the things that they should really, really, consider and think about before making that move?
Ooh. Experience, I think, is key. Getting into things like internships and stuff like that, because like one of the things that I really enjoyed when I was at Kwani was seeing people who, started out in the editorial department and then spent time also understanding what was happening in marketing and then how to run a festival and all of this. So in fact, the group Jalada, I believe, were formed. They were working at Kwani at the time, and then they went to a workshop together, and then they started their own entity. And I really love Jalada for taking that plunge to this day, because sometimes the kind of things that we want to build, the kind of energies that we want to see around us, and the kind of work that we want to produce is not always something that other people are giving us an opportunity to. So Jalada, I think, is a really good example of creating your own space. Not everyone has the privilege to do that, of course, but I think getting together with like-minded people, for me at least, has been one of the single most satisfying things. Finding people who are kind of thinking like you, or people who can challenge you, or people who want to help you challenge the things that you want to challenge. So I feel like finding experience and like-minded people is what, for me, has been a really kind of good thing.
Yeah. Fantastic. Angela, I'm afraid we're all out of time already. This has been very, very short, but thank you so much for sharing those thoughts and insights with us. I wish you all the best with Book Bunk and Bunk Books. I'm actually reading The Havoc of Choice at the moment, loving it so far. Yes. Thank you very, very much. And to everybody else who tuned in and listened to us chatting here, thank you very much. We'll be having more interviews with more amazing women publishers and women in the publishing industry, whether they are, creators of spaces, writers themselves, just publishers. And we hope that you'll join us for that as well. Angela, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.